Okay, fantastic. So hello, everybody. Welcome to INSEAD Endeavor and Women in Business event, Riding the Energy Transition, separating the truly sustainable projects and investments from the greenwashing or well-intentioned but wasteful approaches. My name is Gabi Glesner-Cipollone. I'm the Endeavor UK representative, and I will today moderate and speak at this event. Regarding my background, I'm a business transformation executive and independent board advisor. I've been working with the INSEAD Community Impact Challenge to support the United Nations Climate Change's Race to Zero campaign, through which I've advised numerous organizations on becoming carbon neutral. I've worked more than 20 years in business and digital transformation, having led multiple initiatives at Fortune 500 financial services companies and big consulting firms. So let's hear from the other panelists. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Gabby. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Chris McNally, Head of Automotive and Mobility Equity Research at Evercore ISI. I've been covering the automotive space globally from both the buy side and the sell side for the last 20 years. And I actually joined the advisory board of the Biophysical Economics Institute earlier this year. I'm actually a former Columbia Business School grad, so please don't hold that against me.
Great. Patrick, you want to go on?
Sure. So my name is Patrick Kent. I'm from Newton Investment Management, where I run the small and mid-cap opportunistic strategies currently, and head of the mid-cap research team. In addition to that, prior to that, I actually was at Wellington Management, where I helped to develop the Wellington Impact Fund, starting back sort of 2011, 2012, which was the first diversified public equity impact fund in GIN. So that's sort of the current bio. Chris and I worked together actually years ago, once upon a time.
Okay, sounds great. John Peter, coming to you.
Yeah, hello everybody, and it's great to be here. My name is Jan Peter Oostrom, and I'm currently president for the Biophysical Economics Institute that Chris referred to. That's a non-profit that's consisting of academics and people from the corporate and financial world with the aim to enhance economic decision making, which is the topic we're talking about here now. So I'm excited. Before that, I spent about 19 years in finance leadership roles in the energy industry, most of which was with Shell, where I headed up capital planning and reporting for the Americas business, and I was CFO for Europe's largest refinery. And more recently, I focused a lot on corporate transformations and improvement projects.
Fantastic. Okay, so before we start, I would like to share a few housekeeping rules with everyone. So we are following Chatham House rules in the webinar today. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and there will be time for questions at the end of the panel discussion. So let's get started. There are trillions of dollars chasing ESG investments, and virtually every company is portraying itself as sustainable. However, when applying unbiased natural sciences, it becomes clear that despite the good intentions, some approaches are merely a wasteful draw on our planet's precious resources, whereas others are more sustainable than they might initially appear. So one of the questions we wanted to address to start with is really, how useful is the ESG framework to pick truly sustainable investment projects? And if I may just get started on this one, I would say that from an impact investing perspective, the United Nations ESG framework with the Sustainability Development Goals is actually quite good. It can help organizations to define and shape ESG outcomes. And the most advanced topic is the reduction of carbon emission, including innovative energy management. What the United Nations have done, they have launched an initiative, the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, which is a global effort to mobilize real economy actors to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. And this initiative actually requires a standardized methodology, the science-based target approach, to calculate an organization's carbon footprint independently of its industry, geography, or size. And in the meantime, we have seen more than 7,500 companies making the pledge to the United Nations successfully. But we also have seen some challenges. So some of them are the validating and tracking of organizations' carbon emission plans. It's the whole topic about carbon offsetting and of course the scope 3 emissions, specifically when it comes to downstream aspects. Chris, as someone who advises on stock picks for a living, how much guidance do you get from the ESG framework to differentiate between stocks, and how useful do you find this?
Thanks so much, Gabby. And maybe, you know, it's an interesting way to kick off the conversation, because the answer is sort of not much, honestly, and I would say at least from a quantifiable or let's call it a repeatable process, right? And inherently that lies the problem. ESG is a super important concept, right? There's no discussion about that. One with amazing and impactful intentions, but I think it's been said it's something that we need to get right. So currently it's a very, you know, esoteric concept as it relates to stock valuation specifically. It's clearly a fund flow, it's a pool of capital, but, you know, one that everyone wants a piece of. So if I look at my business in autos, in the last 3 years in particular, it's been a focus really only on the E, you know, within autos. And that impact, to be clear, has been ginormous, right? It's tripled the market cap of the global auto OEM space. Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, NIO, all the various SPACs which followed. They now combine for anywhere from 50 to 60% of the global market cap in autos, or $2 trillion, when that used to be only 700 billion for really the last 20 years. And as everyone knows, Tesla is the majority of that seismic change. You know, for example, Tesla's market cap could fall 85% and still be twice the size of a legacy OEM like GM. But from a practical implementation or a framework, ESG in autos is all over the place. Just look at Tesla as an example, which is thought of as the poster child for everything change in electric vehicles, but was recently removed from one of the large S&P ESG index. So I think there's still a lot of tough questions, but all which point to the need to more numbers and less qualitative sentiment, in my personal opinion. And honestly, that's one of the things that attracted me to join the advisory board of the, you know, Biophysical Economics Institute more than anything else, is to be a force of change in, you know, that repeatability or quantification of ESG.
Super. I would like to move over to Patrick. As a fund manager, where you are looking both for returns and meeting sustainability expectations from investors, how relevant is the ESG framework for this aspect?
Yeah, so I guess it's maybe the place to start there, right, would be to sort of how I think about ESG more broadly versus the framework, because it's an interesting, like as an industry of capital allocators, like this is a unique time that suddenly this has become, and I say suddenly over the last decade, right, that this has become, you know, as Chris said before, a large pool of assets, many firms offering, you know, ESG forward strategies or ESG integrated strategies or sustainability strategies. And all of these terms are a bit sort of commingled. And as someone who's kind of observed the industry and been interested in this as far back as sort of 14, 15 years ago, and to see, you know, and to be involved in the impact fund development, I really think about ESG as about externalities, right? We're really talking about, and when those externalities are smaller, we could sort of lump them together as E, S, and G, and then put them in a category and set them aside. And now that's kind of come out of the corner and taken over a large part of the industry in a sense, right? This is where we've seen a lot of capital flow over the last few years. But sort of, I think the question to me has always been, you know, is ESG as a framework really about just understanding unintended risks and liabilities associated with a business that maybe traditional financial analysis doesn't capture, right? And that's really, and where we've gone with this is to sort of to score companies and say, you know, these are higher grade, these are lower grade along E, S, and G. But what's problematic about that to me is that underlying that, and you certainly see it when we roll these up to scores, is there's sort of an implicit conversion table going on here between sort of an E violation, an S violation, and a G violation, right? And how many governance bad governance practices are okay to offset you're being a good environmental practitioner, right? So I think that some of that to me doesn't make a lot of sense in a larger perspective. And I think where we need to probably evolve to, and this is sort of coming back to your question about how I use it in practice, is to sort of think more about separating them and thinking about the materiality of those things. And so, certainly when we worked on impact of the Wellington Impact Fund, it wasn't an ESG integrated fund, but obviously ESG was going to be a key component to what we were doing, because we were focused more on thematic alignment and measurement of outcome impact as the first order. But of course, we didn't want to see any significant sort of ESG violators in the portfolio. So that was sort of our kind of screening process, looking for making sure there was nothing that we didn't, that would sort of preclude us from owning it in impact. Currently, as opportunistic investor, so where I am focused on small and mid cap opportunistic, there's the process is really focused on deriving the intrinsic value. Now, obviously, there's a lot of ways to do that. We have our own sort of process for doing that, but key to that process is taking a full accounting of the liabilities and a risk assessment of that business. And to me, that's really where you want to sort of include, can we take at least a first order look at what the material impact might be from something, whether that's like looking at their carbon exposure and trying to price it in a tax scenario, and then looking at that as a potentially discounted liability, right? Or some trying to come to a sort of quantifiable view of what that might be, or it's adjusting your discounting rate because you want to take into account some sort of larger operating risks that may be associated with it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. So Jan-Peter, to bring you into the discussion, how corporates, how do they react to this?
Yeah, so as a whole, corporates, they tend to lag a bit, right? Because they're a bit more reactionary to the changes in the sort of investor focus and the investor demands. And we've seen that also with ESG. That some of them came a little bit later, but then it was quite a painful and dramatic adjustment for some. And you see a lot of firms that, especially in the energy sector, that really changed their strategies quite fundamentally. So it's had a big impact for sure, but it's also had some issues, right? And I think one of the issues that you see in particular in sectors that got labeled as bad in ESG terms, which you could argue are the ones that need to improve the most, that they tend to get excluded altogether from portfolios, and as such, these are sectors that might provide products that are pretty essential for today's economy, and they might be doing good things, I guess, in ESG terms by being more efficient, cutting carbon, or going into more renewable businesses, but they might not get credit for it because they're in the bad box, right? And that creates a problem, and the investors, there's basically the sustainability investors moves away, and the ones that are left just want to see the financial returns, and that creates almost a perverse incentive the other way. One other factor. One big challenge for a lot of these companies, but how do you juggle the desire to become more efficient, cut carbon, which typically takes a little bit of time with the demands for immediate returns. Now that the energy prices more recently have gone up a bit, especially in the energy industry, I think that's also a little bit of a hope that means that there's some increased differentiation that investors will look at things. Another factor, and I think Patrick touched a bit on that already, is the variability in ESG scores that different companies get, where the same company might get a whole range of different scores by different ESG scoring agencies. And linked to that is also disclosure standards, right? So you've got a lot of requirements for non-financial data tied to these ESG issues, but a lot of it is non-standardized, right? So it's increasingly more important, but it's not standardized yet. So that's quite a big requirement of putting it out there and is not quite sure which ones are necessarily the key ones.
Okay. No, I think that's really a fair description of the situation that we're facing. So when we look at what could be solutions to that, so what is a measurable way to help us to cut through this? Patrick, could you give us some perspectives on that?
Sure. I mean, this is a lot to unpack, but let me kind of maybe start here. I mean, I come back to this point about really ESG being sort of more about externalities. And I'd say, you know, again, I think it's worth taking the time to sort of step back and think about a first principle sort of, you know, view of this and ask sort of why have these become so relevant, right? And I think the view of sort of certainly those of us, you know, involved with the Biophysical Economics Institute is really about the fact that we have not taken a very biophysical view of the economy. We've really kind of, you know, distanced natural sciences from our thinking about economic activity. And, you know, the result of that is that we, you know, certainly in the case of, you know, energy, we think of it as something that is just substitutable and not essential to the overall functioning of the economy. When in fact, I'd say that's, you know, could not be more wrong. I mean, I don't know how to more strongly say that, right? Energy, and I don't just mean oil, I just mean primary energy in general, is non-substitutable and describes all of GDP, right? It really explains every single thing we do. And it really comes back to, I think, you know, what we're really saying is that, you know, a neoclassical or traditional way of thinking about this really only considers money to be kind of a, you know, a store of value, a medium of transaction, you know, relative measuring. But those are all true. And that is sort of the textbook answer I think anyone would give. But I think more importantly, I think certainly from the biophysical view, you know, money is really about it's a call on work, right? It's an IOU on work, and that takes energy. Every single thing takes energy. As you know, one of our esteemed advisory board is Steve Keen, an economist, is very pithily said, you know, labor without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a sculpture. So if you don't have, so that I say this because I think it's important to level set how certainly one of the key metrics I think we focus on, right? Because I think once you sort of start to look at the economy as more a sum total of energy conversions, that actually starts to break down how we approach solutions, because we want to think in terms of, do these things add net energy? And do they create or do they create more efficiency with energy? And certainly the metrics that, you know, the Institute, or the approach that the Institute has really taken with this, is to talk about sort of energy return on energy invested. So thinking more about sort of, you know, when you're focused on a solution that is going to produce primary energy, is that something that takes more energy to produce than it potentially can actually output, in which case it really isn't, it's a negative return project, right? You shouldn't really go down that road. And I think, you know, and we've sort of taken the approach that anything that produces clean energy is positive, potentially, right? But it's important that we understand sort of the net energy density of that and how much energy it can produce for the energy it takes to produce in the first place. That's one. But the other side would be sort of taking this efficiency. So if we take, when energy is applied, are we getting a payback of more energy saved on the other side? So that's sort of an energy saved on energy invested. This focus is very much on sort of, again, coming back to Chris's point, right? Like in auto, so that the focus is very much on E. And it sounds a lot like this is focused on E. And, you know, I could open a very big can of worms when we say, like, I think this misunderstanding has much broader implications for externalities across not just the environment, but actually social and even governance perspectives, because this fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying sort of model or the production function and the intersection with monetary policy over years has actually created some of these externality problems.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic approach, but I think what we're all also interested in is some examples where this approach really leads to radically different insights and makes a difference. Because at the end of the day, that's what's important for us. Where can we make a difference in our environment and in society? So Chris, maybe you want to give us a start on this one.
Sure. So, you know, let's follow on, you know, Patrick's line of reasoning and give two examples within auto. So let's start with, you know, the bad example in my opinion, ethanol introduction in the mid 2000s in autos within the US. If you step back and think about this, We grew corn, which we didn't have enough of, to blend with gasoline at the minimal impact to the environment of a 10% blend, never taking into account that net energy required to grow the corn using fertilizers, tractors, transporting the ethanol, things that all required fossil fuel energy. And maybe compare that to some of the work that the BPE has done in the world of electrification, where research was done on a quantifiable or ESOI basis, energy saved on energy invested, for something like an advanced silicon carbide inverter for electric motors. And we compared that to a traditional inverter, and it was shown to have a 7x greater net energy savings, right? And that's something that needs to be considered, because silicon carbide inverters to create are actually energy intensive. And that's some of the work that the Institute did for Wolfspeed last year. And maybe JP, you can talk a little bit about the actual project itself.
Yep.
Yeah.
Jan Peter.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me say a couple of things. So this was a short project, and this is not to plug this, but rather to illustrate it, because I think this is the kind of thing that gets the insight. So so Wolfspeed, they produce semiconductors, right? And their semiconductors tend to have a higher sort of energy and carbon footprint to make per semiconductor. Sort of life cycle analysis on the net energy and CO2 picture of that, and looked at the production process there. And what that basically showed, what Chris just mentioned, is that by spending a little bit more energy on making these things, you actually save a lot of energy in the efficiency of electric vehicles and solar panels. So they were able to then go and tell this to the market, and they got very positive feedback. And I think this illustrates a little bit the point that Patrick was making, is that you're having something that actually saves the world energy. So you're having a product that is truly sustainable at a biophysical sense. And another example of insight is, of course, the one Chris just touched on, which is the corn-based ethanol, right? It sounds green because it's marketed as biofuels. But if it doesn't really add net energy, then how does it really help us as a society, right? And you then also, as you shine the light through that, you basically discover, hey, by investing in something like this, you're basically taking a bet on the US farmers lobby, right? And its strength. So as a society, over time, this is not the kind of thing you want to do, because it's more energy that you will then need to get from somewhere else. Biomass is one of those other things. It could work, but it's one of those things that you got to look very carefully. Where do you get it from? How much energy does it take to get it to a plant? How much energy does it take you to build that plant? Another one that can look, that most likely look quite terrible, although there's no few ones operational, is direct air capture CO2 removal, right? So this is one of those things which you say, well, it's good because it removes CO2, but if you then look at the amount of energy that it takes to run these things, to build these things, and you look at all the other alternatives that are out there to reduce CO2, then you think, well, this actually, from a biophysical perspective, it's not a smart idea, right? And then if you go the other way around, so you look at some of the things that may not be as popular, but maybe the underlying physics is a lot more compelling. And one of them is nuclear, right? It's from a physics and net energy perspective, it's really strong. So you'll see over the long time, that's probably gonna gain more use, because the physics is just compelling, right? And I think we're seeing a little bit already as was on the back of the recent energy crunch. Another area, maybe the more dirty businesses, and this is probably not very popular, but when you look at parts of oil and gas mining and other industrial operators, there are certain activities that are there to just make those activities that are going on and going to continue to go on for a while more efficient, and the benefit that it gives. And if you look at, for instance, something like an Aramco or an ADNOC that are producing some of the that are producing oil, which we need to decarbonize, but for now, those are the lowest CO2 barrels out there. So you would expect they would be needed for some period of time. So if you would invest in things that would help to make those more efficient today, that is an inherent help. So this is just a couple to get a view here.
Okay, great. And Patrick, would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I'll come back and touch on something because I think it's important to sort of better understand why a sort of this natural sciences approach, I think, to some of these is key. I mean, and then I'll end sort of maybe come around to an example of something or an insight that's sort of that I've had, at least from the portfolio perspective. But take JP mentioned corn ethanol, and I think this is important because something, you know, if you look at the sort of if you look into sort of why this is proposed as a sort of a green option, because obviously this is emittive, right? This is carbon emittive at some level, right? You are taking a fuel and burning it, so therefore it is creating carbon. And the only reason it actually shows some reduction versus other solutions is that we've taken it, that they give them the benefit of the circularity of growing the corn and capturing some, and that's really all the benefit, right? That really, I think the numbers are a 40% reduction. But the 40%, it's almost equivalent carbon emissions. It's just that 40% of those are now supposedly recaptured through the growing of the crop that feeds it. So I think there's a couple of problems with that, right? Immediately, right off the bat, by not taking a systems approach, by not taking natural sciences approach to that, you've left out your impact on biodiversity. We're talking about monocropping large scale in order to do this. You're not talking about your topsoil depletion that will happen over time, and therefore would create even more fossil fuel intensity as time went on. If this was to scale this solution, right, you'd even be more dependent on sort of fossil fuel-based fertilizers. And if you sort of give the credit of we'll move to sort of more green options, some like hydrogen-based or something, these are now going to become even more energy intensive. So the ROI would collapse. So I think this idea of making sure that we're taking like a true systemic look at these solutions before just embarking on them avoids, you know, what I would say is, you know, a sustainability tragedy of the commons, right? Where any one sort of small project without scale looks like it might be a great solution, in which case we then pour a lot of capital into it, scale it, and if it doesn't have sort of thermodynamic sustainability, it's really going to end up costing us, and that could actually lead to you know, much more significant problems. An example, I was going to say, maybe a counterintuitive insight, or one that I can even relate back to sort of even investing in public equities, is to sort of really start to relax our thinking about sort of exclusion and inclusion, right? And because, you know, it's going to take sort of everything we have and most of the resources to accomplish what we're trying to do. I've said to Chris and JP that, you know, having observed ESG sustainability impact over the last kind of 14 years, I would say I've watched the industry grow from complete denial that this was sort of nothing that needed to be addressed in any kind of large scale by, you know, the financial industry, to sort of bargaining that we're now like, oh, not only we're going to do it, it's what active management's going to do. We've created this reason for this to you know, a whole new amount of work to evaluate this, and it's going to be even better, right? So I think we're moving now toward sort of acceptance, right? That we have to start to say like, okay, there are trade-offs here. We've introduced, like, once you've introduced things like a carbon budget, you've started to introduce absolute scarcity to the system. And when you do that you have trade-offs. Nothing is perfect. There is no and sort of, you know, better could be the enemy of good enough in some cases, right? And then this sort of takes to the nuclear question. We may not love it, but it certainly is our sort of highest energy density, lowest carbon emitted form of energy we have, and it's incredibly stable when it's running, right? It's base load power. It's not intermittent, so that doesn't have that sort of large scale systemic effects of having to manage that variability. But also just this idea of like, if you're relaxing your exclusion, you start to sort of ask the question. I mean, we built an energy infrastructure over more than 100 years, right? With low cost energy. And now we're going to endeavor to replace it in several decades, which to me says, all right, well, that's an enormous amount of engineering and construction work that's going to happen here. I mean, that's a lot of engineers moving a lot of material. And if we're not sort of thinking about what is a sustainable growth rate for that, or what's a realistic optimized growth rate for that, we may actually cause more problems than we're trying to solve.
Okay. That's fantastic. And building on what you just said, I would like to add 2 points. One of them is, yes, we know that the big oil and gas companies themselves, they are challenged with the transition themselves because they are really in the middle of it. So what Exxon, Chevron, Shell and co companies are thinking, at the moment is simply to divest high emission assets into the private equity industry. So again, opportunities to apply what you're thinking or apply new ways of energy management may not be solved within the industry themselves, but may be solved in other industries. And the other point I wanted to make is that energy transition projects, they also need to be considered within their whole lifespan. What you just said, circular economy, super important, and also within their economic, social governance context. So quick example is a Tunisian bank that I advised recently. They wanted to financially support a solar energy plant in Tunisia, obviously because of the favorable sunshine conditions in this country. And only when they did the detailed plan, it turned out that this would have a considerable negative impact on the local biodiversity. So again, it's an energy, but it's also a wider sustainability picture. And that makes it just a little bit more complex than you think at the beginning, right?
I think that's right. And one maybe follow on to that, I wanted to just mention, because you did bring up the sort of circular economy concept. And I think this is, sometimes I think I could be accused of being a little bit too argumentative on this point, but every time we sort of talk about this theme, and it's a theme that comes up everywhere, we sort of see circular economy repeated many, many times. And I understand that it's meant to be sort of a shorthand, but I really sort of push back on the idea that we should even think about it that way. What you're really saying is we want a hyper efficient economy that's like recycling resources, but nothing's circular. I mean, that's just a perpetual motion machine. And if we think we have one that just is going to work without inputs, we are delusional. So that is going to take an intense amount of energy. It would have to be clean energy to even be able to do those things. So to make something, quote, circular. So I think that, everything degrades. So we need to have like a realistic view of these, these proposed solutions, again, at that, like a full life cycle sort of assessment. Exactly. Yeah, and a net energy analysis of them to understand if they're sustainable from a thermodynamic perspective.
Exactly. So absolutely agree. And the next question would be, how would you embed this type of thinking in a practical way to day-to-day investment decision-making within companies to make themselves more sustainable over time? Jan-Peter, do you want to get us started? Yeah.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah. So, and this is, I think the basic process for investment decisions and capital allocation is probably pretty similar in most companies. And I still remember the course by Kevin Keisner, which is a while back, on valuation, which is just really quite instructive. But I think that the basic concept is you make a cash flow forecast to forecast the cash flow consisting of cost and revenue, and you discount those, and then calculate a bunch of ratios such as the IRR, and of course you also want to add your CO2 profile to that, now that you also probably want to incorporate in your cash out, assuming a certain CO2 price, and that allows you to come up with some CO2 ratios as well, like carbon intensity, CO2 per product. And that then allows you to compare investment projects and pick the most attractive ones. And I think that's probably what most people are doing or are trying to do in some way, shape, or fashion. I think the issue that people run into is that there's a number of assumptions in that are just arbitrary and uncertain. And that's especially in the energy business, where things are inherently uncertain, right? So what do you assume for a CO2 price, and how confident are you that some of the pricing assumptions for your revenue are correct? What about taxes, subsidies, regulatory space? And for longer term projects, which most energy projects are, this is a big deal, and these are real risks, right? So how can you, for instance, if you're saying, hey, I'm going to invest in sustainable aviation fuel, how do you know that the current premium pricing or subsidy in that space is going to persist, right? And how comfortable are you to take a bet on that, basically? And so there's a recent piece of work that I did, because I got quite intrigued by this, to look into this. And there's a paper that's about to come out, which I wrote with Charlie Hall, who's a famous ecologist who came up originally 40 years ago with the term energy return on energy invested by researching Salmons. And it should come out probably next week or so in Energy Policy, which is a journal. But the main idea is that you basically take the discounted cash flow forecast and you take a couple of biophysical assumptions around it. And since you basically have most of the assumptions already needed to come up with the DCF, coming up with an energy return on energy invested, an energy saved on energy invested view next to it is quite easy. And then all of a sudden you might see very different answers between the DCF and your biophysical ratios. And that might tell you that you've got a red flag, right? Maybe you've got an issue here where your entire project is really premised on a certain market bubble or premium pricing to persist, or maybe there's some regulatory aspects or tax aspects that may look favorable now, but if the underlying physics suggests that it's not particularly attractive from a total society, that should be a red flag for you to look more deeply. And that's something that really helps with those trade-offs, I think. Okay,
great. Yeah. So, Chris, do you want to add to the topic, everything is a trade-off, right?
No, it's a perfect lead in. I mean, if again, going back to that academic research, I think we need to start talking about like the ecological footprint, right? Or the life cycle, and not just the end result of carbon reducing initiatives. And it's just completely applicative to everything that I'm seeing in the world of electrification today, where we could start with the premise that we all agree 100% of cars are going to be electric in year X in the future, but then let's sort of work backwards to what would be required to achieve that. We need $1 trillion of global battery spend, something on the order of 200 massive Tesla-sized gigafactories, which, to Patrick's point, are built with lots of steel, lots of oil, lots of diesel in terms of transport, lots of E&C work. We need to mine for lithium, cobalt. Cobalt is mostly mined in the Congo, sometimes using unethical practices such as artisanal mining, which is a sort of a euphemism for child labor. 80% of the processing today in battery minerals, that supply base, currently all in China. Right, so another ethical, political governance concern that needs to be addressed over time. And then finally, if we want to work to sort of the net energy, what is the source of the electricity to power the grid, to power electric vehicles? It's a very different ratio in different parts of the EU or California, where the grid may be green versus China. But these are sort of the life cycle global EV thematics that someone like Patrick, as a portfolio manager, needs to consider across multiple sectors, as opposed to just looking at that output of electric vehicles specifically.
Okay, perfect. So in terms of decision making from a green investment or impact investment perspective, I mean, what do you need to look out for? First of all, you do want to look out for measurements that have a real impact. And I think we've heard quite a bit about that today, and that's really fantastic. But you should also check them over time to ensure their advancement. So when you look at annual reports from organization, and you should look at how does this company compare to its industry peers? Is it a leader? Is it a lagger? How close is the company to their own goals? Are the goals ambitious enough? Are they unrealistically ambitious? Is there a clear roadmap with clear actions and budget allocation for the implementation of the changes announced? Or are they just wishes and promises? And we know how big corporations work. Without allocated budget, nothing is happening. And one of the things that really was striking me is the question, is the plan too far out in the future? Because we know ambitions for more than 10 years can easily be postponed or deprioritized. And this is particularly relevant for all the major big organizations that have joined the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, because they have deadlines in 2040, 2050, which is really quite some time down the road to become carbon neutral. And finally, really look, do companies properly disclose their emissions for scope 1, 2, and 3? And if you don't want to do that, or if you want to look for another alternative, another approach is really to check how companies are doing in various sustainability rankings. They are available on the internet, they are publicly accessible. And if a company is performing poorly on these rankings, there is really a high probability that they are promising more than they can deliver. So in summary, I would say scrutiny has increased significantly over the past few years. There's an increasing amount of expert information available, and also impact investors are becoming more and more experts on sustainable investments. But it is important that the pressure is felt by the companies, because otherwise they won't do anything. And the last point about greenwashing, yes, greenwashing is around it. There will always be some greenwashing around us. Greenwashing is getting more sophisticated as well, but honestly, I believe it does not matter, because there is less and less space to hide. So with other words, the shadow is disappearing every day. Patrick, do you want to make some final comments on the subject?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would make a couple of comments about how, this is kind of a difficult task from the investment perspective, right? Because, certainly this is something where, we have initiatives in place to get better data, but data is an issue, right? I mean, we don't have, certainly I live this in the small and mid-cap world as I look at investing in small and mid-cap companies. Certainly coming back to where we started on ESG scores, right? There is a big absence of evidence is evidence of absence problem inside of small and medium-sized companies, where traditionally they'll score sort of neutral to negative because of a quote lack of disclosure, when in reality it's really about the scale of the company, and they don't have the sort of the size of a major corporation and or all the consultants that they are hired to create these nice sustainability reports that are put out by many of the larger companies. So I feel like setting some standards on these approaches is going to be incredibly important, and getting more data and better data over time will certainly help. And I think from investment perspective, having helped build out when we started the Wellington Impact Fund, we didn't have we needed a framework for measurement, and there really wasn't a framework for measurement that existed in the public equity space. And so we created one. And so having sort of created a way of doing this, you can always see the flaws in your own approach, very easily, right? So, I mean, looking back at sort of how we kind of considered this, and we really went, investment by investment, because there were different themes. And so we had different outcomes that we were trying to measure, and so different measurement approaches to each of these. And I think the issue I sort of saw over time is that you don't get a net portfolio view. You only get the sort of investment view. And so we come back to this singular investment view, which comes back to a little like that concept of the micro versus the macro, the project versus the system, the individual investment versus the portfolio, right? And I could say this, like on the impact side, you might have a company that was lowering emissions and you're giving them credit for that. And on the other side, you have a financial inclusion company that, when you look at what they're actually doing, they're selling they're financing used diesel burning trucks to small farmers and businessmen in India. That's great. It's absolutely has a social impact for those people who need that, who maybe need that for their living, but it's contributing to your carbon emission problem, right? So we haven't taken a net sort of effect of this. And so where my mind has gone recently is to sort of start to think more about, certainly when I talk about not taking exclusions or hard exclusions, sort of a priori or ex ante when you're looking at things, because of the scale of some of the changes we're looking to try to do. I'm looking now at sort of measuring more along try to look at the portfolio level. And this is some stuff we've been trying to develop, is either looking at, the energy intensity ratios. That's borrowed a bit from the work by Kerry King at the University of Texas, who's but also the looking at sort of, kind of a planetary boundaries framework that we could try to look at scoring sort of not just across just carbon emissions, but maybe more than that, right? And again, this is a little bit of an environmental sort of focus, but I think it's important because, that these environmental impacts do sort of feed back to social impacts.
Okay, super, fantastic. I would really like to thank all of you for this fantastic and insightful insights. Before we cut to the Q&A, I would like to take this opportunity to flag another webcast that the Biophysical Economics Institute is putting up tomorrow. I know we only scratched the surface with some of the stuff today, so this would be a great opportunity for anybody who's interested to dig deeper. I'm going to put the details and the linked event in the chat, so if you're interested, just copy paste. it's a bit last minute, but if you find it interesting, then I think it's a great way to learn more about it. So Jan-Peter, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, no, thanks, Gabby, and indeed. So tomorrow, actually, we have two leading academics in this space up to talk a bit more about the insights and the methods. So this is Dave Murphy, who's done quite a bit of research in this space, and Kerry King that. Yeah, so Dave is going to talk a bit about energy and some of the key ratios. How do you really calculate? How do you do this sort of net energy view in practice? And Kerry from UT Austin, who's just written a book on this topic, he's going to talk a bit how you could also take the same way of thinking and really apply it to the macro space, right? And the kind of insights that gives you. And that is actually kind of eye-opening if you take a net energy view to the broader economy, that there's certain trends that suddenly make a lot more sense, and that's some interesting angles to take.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot. So as I said, it's in the chat box. Just copy, paste, and join in. In terms of question and answer, we now move into the section. So first of all, we want to have a look at the questions in the chat box. So if any of the speakers raises a hand and say, this is a really fantastic questions, I would like to answer that, please let me know. Anything out there? Any volunteers for any questions? So one of the questions is, can you please give some examples of bedrock projects? We had this discussion today already. Is there anything you would like to add to that?
So they're looking for investments or projects that are maybe again, kind of coming to a different conclusion. Is that sort of what I'm assessing here?
It's a question from Magdalena. Can you please give some examples of bad box projects?
Yeah, I think there's probably almost too many to list in that sense. But I'd come back to this, what you mentioned, sort of the science-based target, right? So I mean, even the science-based targets for carbon reduction, I think important, but the science component of that tends to be more about the initiative itself, not necessarily how you're going to get there, right? And I think, each company sort of laying out their plan that makes some sense. But I think I think as we're looking through supply chains, there are more projects than I would even be able to list if we took the rest of the day, right? That should have some sort of like efficiency assessment, because the first way to reduce carbon is literally just reduce your energy, like improve your energy efficiency at every level, full stop, right? That becomes, and I think taking a high ESOI, or energy saved on energy invested approach to that, would allow, using these resources effectively to really try to, reduce our carbon intensity, because at a macro level, energy use goes up and to the right, carbon emissions have been up and to the right, right? We don't have, we haven't really disconnected this in any way yet, right? And so I think versus just improving, moving from one energy source to another, which, by the way, in the course of history, we've never done. Like we burn more firewood today than we did, 100 years ago. We only really have ever added sources of energy. And so if we're really thinking about energy transition, I think the first order of business should be really looking at at every level, trying to find more efficient solutions. But, we alluded to things like, carbon capture, and I would say, it depends, right? I mean, I think if we look at, direct capture at the source of production, there might be some, again, they need to be evaluated. There's almost no way it doesn't raise the cost of production and or refinement. But it may still be, valid in some way. I think direct air capture, on the other hand, and I don't know if anyone's involved in this, I'm going to say, I don't understand how it can possibly ever be anything other than a perpetual motion machine. To the idea that you could take a ton of material, extract the energy from it, blow it out, blow the resulting material mass out into the atmosphere, and then you're going to collect it and put it back underground with anything less than the energy you got from it in the first place, seems seems ludicrous. So I we'll see. I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but it seems again to depend on a very high energy density source of energy and low emission source of energy that we don't have yet. I mean,
okay. Anybody wants to add something to Patrick's contribution? Otherwise, there are other questions.
Yeah,
coming up. Yep.
Yeah, Gabby. So let me try to add something briefly, because I think it's a great question, actually. And like, what are maybe some other examples where you want to apply this, right? And one that's sort of screaming for an analysis like this in my mind is the hydrogen space, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because hydrogen is one of those things where you could imagine it making sense, like in certain areas with certain parameters around it. But at the same time, some of the things being talked about, the energy round trips of first turning something into hydrogen and then later on turning it back into electricity, and then the loss along the way are such that you might lose half the energy from that entire process, and then you might feel good about it by calling it green. But if you haven't done the actual physical calculation in a way that's robust and really looks at the life cycle from a net energy perspective, then that's not necessarily the case, right? So I can imagine that within certain parameters that does make sense, but in my view, the math around it just needs to be done.
Well, and I'd say even think about this too. I love, this is a great example. This is probably the best example that we could have given, because this is something where we're really pushing a lot of capital toward these solutions. And not only do hydrogen is not a source of energy, it's just an energy storage medium. And I think, so we'd have to take energy to create it. It's got conversion efficiencies at every level you're trying to impact. But even more, the importance of taking a life cycle assessment to these solutions is, one, hydrogen is literally the smallest and most reactive compound in the universe. So if you're building pipelines and storage containment, it's going to corrode, it's going to leak. When it leaks, it reacts with the atmosphere to create its own emissions. Like, there are a whole life cycle assessment that needs to be done based on the natural sciences of these solutions to know whether they really scale the way we think they do before we pour literally trillions of capital, which, going back to my earlier point, literally trillions of resources and energy into scaling these solutions.
Okay. We got another interesting question on carbon. So carbon is one of the most quantifiable things out there. And with the net zero journey we are on, how does that lens compare to that? And how does that link to value? Who wants to get started? Patrick, again?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it would be helpful to think about how I think about carbon and its role in climate change. Sort of, again, I think coming back to that sort of, first principle sort of approach, I'd say what we've really done here is what we're implicitly acknowledging is that this was a resource that we have used up without pricing it, right? I mean, we had some sort of limited waste assimilation capacity in the atmosphere that we have been running down. And, for those who think, these are all business school alumni, so everyone will get what I mean when I say we've taken the balance sheet and run it through the income statement, right? We've been sort of using this up without pricing it. I think that's, it's certainly it is a first order thing we can focus on. And I think it's something that is obviously important that we get our arms around the resource left. We're not continuing to use it without pricing it. These are and it is something extremely measurable. So that's positive. I think the other side of this, of course, is that we need to understand, coming back to the sort of the common theme of a lot of what we talked about, that we need to understand, the solutions to these and have other metrics alongside the reduction that allow us to know just exactly how sustainable they are. Okay.
Chris, you want to add something to this?
Yeah, words like quantifiable carbon, ecological footprint, I think this is the language, that I love, to hear. So great question. I'd be remiss without, I just wrote down when I was thinking about, doing the panel, a reading list, great books like Limits to Growth, Meadows was written 40 years ago, from the Institute, Charlie Hall's Energy and the Wealth of Nations, and more recently, books like How the World Works. When I think about in my business, Patrick mentioned some of these negative projects. I think a lot of it would be to answer, tough questions that we really need more numbers on, numbers that I think right now, haven't been widely available. So within electrification, if we were to look at regional variations and projects on a use case, what's known as well to wheel. So would love an analysis on the ESOI for example, plugins, which have a smaller battery. They are less popular, only really popular in Europe and China, basically don't exist in the US, versus looking at full EVs. And that's where that life cycle question would come in, looking at a smaller battery that works for 95% of the needs of driving, versus we're putting in very large batteries for things like pickups. Now, you can sell essentially 20 small EVs for the size of the battery that's going into a electric Silverado or a Ford Lightning. And then some of the tough questions around hydrogen. So for us, we would love more work done on hydrogen versus battery electric for specific applications like long haul trucking, where we know obviously the carbon and the CO2 footprint is so intensive. So for me, it's actually using this specific net energy frameworks for the type of analysis to make kind of tough decisions, but ones that will be needed to have informed and coordinated government policy.
Okay. And Peter, you comment?
Well, I think a lot of good stuff has been said, but maybe just a minor add here. So because I've had this discussion a few times, also with CTOs of organizations, about how do you, what's different about using net energy relative to using CO2, because they're so correlated. Why don't you just only focus on CO2 because it's out there already, right? I think there's one of the better answers I got to this one is fundamentally net energy is much more of a bedrock variable. That's much of a root variable, whereas CO2, especially because of all the issues around scope 3 measurement, there's a lot of gaming going on in that space, and it's much harder to game fundamental net energy flows, right? So in a way, it gets you a little bit away from the gaming that's going on, and it's just a very sharp, honest lens that shows, hey, does this thing fundamentally add energy, or does it save energy? And if so, how efficient is it at doing that, right? I mean, that's a very sharp lens that is quite hard to game. You can't just game it easily by optimizing supply chain and pushing certain things out.
Yeah, great, thank you. I would like to make a comment on that. From my experience, having worked with United Nations Race to Zero campaign and helping organizations to become net zero and help them along their journey, the energy question itself is one of the challenges, but what is also challenges for organizations when you look at net zero per se is the wider picture, and that is the strategy, it's the work environment, it's the products and services, it's the engagement with suppliers, with customers, when you think about scope 3. So energy itself is a big driver here, but the bigger picture is really what organizations are struggling with, and specifically with scope 3 downstream, to engage, to be, I would say, brave enough to engage with customers to have a discussion about carbon emission reduction. Specifically in the financial services sector, they have a huge lever to have an impact, and they are a little bit reluctant to sit down with their customers and say, okay, we want to give you that loan, but is there anything you can do with that money, that makes our place a more sustainable place? It's not the kind of discussion they're having. And to be honest, when we look at the customers in financial services, survey has shown that while corporate customers are very open to have these discussions, retail customers are really not interested in that at all. They just want to have a good mortgage or a good loan. And strictly speaking, at the moment, they say, I can't bother whether it's sustainable or not in that aspect, because I need the money, I need the loan, and I need to be able to pay it back reasonably well. So that just saying that we have a lot of challenges out here, and energy is at the core of it, but it's also a wider view of it.
Well, I was just maybe I like that point a lot, and at the risk of sort of sneaking in here, one last point. But I mean, we have talked a lot about sort of more environmental side, but I think you're kind of hinting a little bit at where that goes, actually, why this leaks into sort of social concerns as well. Because, when we look at developed world versus developing world, obviously the carbon footprints, environmental footprints of the developed world are, orders of magnitude higher than many of the developing world. And yet we sort of take this, we're all in this to sort of reduce it, but yet the real problem has been created in the first place by the developing world. And this, this happens a lot of vectors, I think, where I think there are really very direct ties from some of these environmental concerns back to sort of social inequality and other types of social problems. Yeah,
that's right. We have another interesting question in our chat box, which is from Magdalena Hinz again. She says, could you kindly refer some reliable matrix computation resources for circular life cycle analysis? Is there anything you can share with us? These are measurements matrix.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll find if you look online, you can find there are lots of sort of life cycle assessment databases out there. Some of them have been, some are better than others, some are more robust, some behind paywalls, some not. So I think you'll find that there are at least a certain amount of available ones to access. But it comes back to my point. I think we need better data on this generally. I mean, it's hard to get easily accessible and scalable data around a lot of these issues, but we try, right? Like imperfect information is better than none, right? It's kind of like every risk model I've ever worked with. They're all terrible, but somewhat useful.
Okay. Anything specific you would like to add to this, Chris or Jan-Peter?
Well, yeah, maybe one just is very, very practical answer. So I think there's one of these databases out there that's a nonprofit one called EcoInvest, and there's a bunch of other tools that sort of link into that one, and that's basically growing out to be this big sort of life cycle analysis database, right? So if you want to make, for instance, an assessment on biofuels as we're doing and growing, one of the things I was reading this morning in the FT on some of the food crisis and some of it going to ethanol type things. Again, if you wanted to indeed analyze what was the embedded energy in that tractor and the tires of that tractor and the steel that was made behind that and all of that entire cycle, and how does that work in terms of a carbon and energy perspective, that's certainly the type of analysis you would want to do, and a lot of them link in through that EcoInvest database.
Yeah, and I would only add, I mean, well-to-wheel analysis has mostly been done in Europe, where this question of plugins versus, for example, full EVs is out there. But to Patrick's point, the output that has come out has been so varied that I think people have started to discount. So I think something that is more standards based, that can be applied across multiple different projects is clearly needed, because I could send you to one consultant project which would give you a completely different answer from another. So definitely need for standards.
Yeah, certainly from an outside looking in kind of perspective of an investor trying to evaluate things without sort of the primary information that maybe an executive working on a corporate investment project would have. I think it's partly more qualitative, right? It's also about the questions you ask. I mean, and just really sort of taking a framework, thinking through, what is the sprawling supply chain of a certain solution, and really asking probing questions when evaluating it as to how much they've thought about some of this.
Okay. So there's one more question that we can take before we wrap it up. And I think it builds on what we've discussed so far, but it's also an interesting perspective. This is from Shaz. And he says, is there an ESG measurement framework that investors currently find most relevant? Because the United Nations guidelines, the Sustainability Development Goals, are really just guidelines. They are not a standardized, accepted investor framework, right?
Yeah, boy, this is an interesting question, because I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a second. Well, I mean, as someone who was we developed the impact fund before the sustainable development goals were even really published, right? And then I've watched, sort of the industry use these, sort of misappropriate these for quote measurement, right? Assign, tagging things to sustainable development goals, which in my mind, some of these are freebies. I mean, almost any company in the world could tag itself with one or two of these. And, I think from how I've kind of approached it and sort of thinking about it, and certainly I've done some development work on a strategy where we are going to use some of this, but I would come at this from, I would argue that there's the goals are certainly well-intentioned, and I never think they were meant entirely for investors, right? These were guidelines for policymakers, for quasi non-government organizations, potentially somewhat for investors, but they were never really meant to be purposed entirely as an investment objective. And I would, from a real world or biophysical perspective, I'd say, again, sort of a little bit pithy here, but if you don't solve sort of 8 of them, you have no hope of solving some of the other ones, right? So these are not sort of separate targets in that sense. They're all interrelated. And if you have to sort of think about it from a systemic approach, and how I've even looked at it is to go one level below those. So for every one of those, as everyone probably on this call knows, it's like every one of those SDGs has tangible targets that are listed underneath those, right? And I think if you go to those targets, sub-targets, and start looking very closely at which ones are truly kind of granular material and investable, that will give you a little better guideline as to what can really be accomplished in the capital markets versus some of these other things that are very aspirational. And I think are, certainly, and that's a good thing, but are unrealistic to sort of allocate capital toward.
Right. Any additions from Chris or Jan-Peter?
No, I think Patrick actually, Patrick from the investment side, I think, lives this day to day. I think we've, what you can hear from my side in terms of evaluation perspective, and, working with companies to help them address the issue is really, there has to be this whole holistic approach and a move away from, and I'm so jaded by being an auto analyst that there has been so much focus on only the E over the last couple of years. And it was just something as simple as one line investing, that electrification was good. EV equals good equals stock goes up. Mm-hmm. And we need to work on something that looks much more holistically at the problem.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, then I would say it's about time that we wrap this one up. It was a fantastic discussion, great insight, and I really appreciate that you all came together. I would like to make a few past points, a summary what we have discussed. One of the things we said was that traditional economics for picking investments has its limitations when looking at sustainability and planetary limits issues such as CO2. We also said the ESG framework has been evolving to address, but has some shortcomings. I think we've heard that also. And one lens is to look at our economy from an energy systems perspective or by a physical angle. So this is particularly relevant for companies and investments related to the energy transition. As a company, you may look at competing investment projects or products and ask yourself, in addition to the carbon picture, does this represent a net energy improvement for the planet or not? If it doesn't, it is unlikely to be sustainable and in sync with the long-term needs of society. One would then expect that over time, the current favorable pricing, if any, may move away, or society governments will impose restrictions or taxes on it that will erode its attractiveness. Last but not least, we mentioned that energy transition projects need to be considered across their whole lifespan. We call that circular economy, and within the economic, societal, and governance context. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot myself about these calculations and details. Thank you so much. It was really great having you here and looking forward to hearing from you.
No, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Bye-bye.